What a week it's been for the homeless, eh? You have Leo Varadkar trying to Jedi mind trick the population into believing that there's no homelessness problem in Ireland and that the figures for homelessness here are low. Then you've Conor Skehan, the head of the government housing agency, saying we shouldn't talk about a crisis. But worst of all was Eileen Gleeson implying that people were homeless because of their own bad behaviour. And when commentators and people on social media replied to these reprehensible comments by blue shirt politicians and their supporters in housing agencies, Junior Minister Damien English came on the airwaves to tell us all we were doing the country damage by talking it down. So generating the worst housing crisis in a generation is okay in Finegael's book, as long as you don't talk about it. But far from the housing crisis being the fault of people on waiting lists, people in mortgage arrears or the homeless, the housing crisis is the result of deliberate government policy. Since the foundation of this state, there has not been an adequate provision of social housing. At the end of the 1900s, Ireland was still under the Empire. Housing for the poor was provided by charitable bodies. Some employers provided housing for their workers, like Guinness's. The British government were worried that having too many slums in Dublin and Cork would undermine the social order. So they instructed local authorities to start providing housing. In the beginning, provision of social housing was mainly in rural areas, where British landlords owned the majority of the land. For Irish tenants of that land, if you couldn't afford to buy out the English landlord, as compensation, the British government offered you rural social housing. The British decided to deal with rural housing separate from the housing of the working classes in the cities. But by 1914, the neglect of social housing was evident, with Dublin Corporation having only built about 1,400 social houses, and with only 2.5% of the population living in social housing. James Connolly and Larkin agitated around the issue of housing, which provoked a response from the Catholic Church, who said the government should provide social housing in order to kill socialism. The British authorities brought in a Housing Act in 1919, but nothing much really changed. In 1922, with the formation of the Free State, you'd think that an independent Irish Republic would have dealt with the problem of social housing, but they didn't. Finegael, the party that would go on to unite with the Blue Shirts and become Finegael, who formed the first government of Ireland, said that they couldn't provide social housing because of the cost and because they were at war. This bias against working class people continued until 1932, when the slum clearance programme began. From 1932 to 1942, Fianna Fáil built 82,000 houses, although many were built by the private sector, with Fianna Fáil, even at this stage, enriching builders and developers and setting up networks of clientelism and patronage. This decade of house building laid the foundation of many of the estates that we know today. But Fianna Fáil didn't build these houses out of the good of their heart. At the time, with the world in economic crisis, many governments turned to what are called Keynesian policies, which is where the state invests in creating jobs to try and keep the economy going. For Fianna Fáil, the investment in social housing was about creating an economy that would benefit them, the builders and the developers. But right from the start, Fianna Fáil started selling off these council houses, saying that a Christian state should have private property as its foundation. In the following decades, social housing provision was neglected. In the mid-60s, the Irish establishment moved towards wholesale sell-off of social housing stock, and the rate of private building overtook the rate of public building. This continued throughout the 70s and into the 80s. But in the 1980s, the turn against the public sector and public housing accelerated massively. For example, there were 7,000 social houses built in 1984. Far too few. But by 1989, there were only 789 social houses built. A massive tenfold decline. There was also an ideological shift as the ruling class party attacked public housing and the public sector as inefficient. They started to present social housing as not being for all workers, but that social housing was about people on welfare and people that lived in ghettos. But it was establishment parties neglecting areas where there were social housing bills that led to the ghettoisation of those areas. So whereas social housing was 15.7% of housing in 1971. By 2002, it had dropped to 6.9%. But the housing crisis isn't the fault of homeless people, or the 90,000 people on waiting lists, or those people who found themselves in mortgage arrears. The housing crisis is a result of deliberate government policy, of right-wing, neoliberal, pro-market policies, of an economy that's shaped towards making profits at the expense of ordinary people's needs.